Right, good morning everybody. I am going to kick us off. Given the extraordinary distance you've all travelled, sometimes further than Greater Manchester it feels, you've all done very well to find this session. We were thinking about whether St John's ambulance should have been stationed halfway along, but it does mean inevitably it sounds like the lifts are a bit of a bottleneck, but if we don't crack on, we'll have about 17 and a half minutes and we'll mess up the rest of the agenda. So I think we'll crack on in the full knowledge that there'll be people arriving a little bit late to the distance. So I'll kick us off. Just a quick note on who I am. It's lovely to see you all. My name's Steve Connor. I'll be chairing this session as well as running a company called Creative Concern. I'm the Green Lead on Greater Manchester's LEP. And then I have a glittering cast to continue the conversation that we've just seen started. I have Becca Herron, who's Strategic Director of Growth and Development for Manchester City Council. I've got John Searle, who is from Salford City Council, Strategic Director of Place. I've got Vernon Everett, who's our Transport Commissioner for Greater Manchester, who we stole from Transport for London, and we're very pleased about that. I've got my good friend Stephen O'Malley from Civic Engineers, who are specialists in all forms of urban engineering, placemaking, urban infrastructure, you name it. And brilliantly, who almost took over chairing from me a minute ago, we've got May Maltino, who's from Trilogy. And May, I might come to you first, actually, in a second, if that's okay. And she's Head of Sustainability and Stakeholder Engagement there. So that's our panel for this morning. And as you know, unless you've made a horrible mistake and think you're about to talk about Liverpool, this is our Greater Manchester enabling agents of change in our cities and really what that whole agenda of change looks like. I'm going to move us through a fairly fast pace because we've squeezed the time a little bit. But principally, this is about a conversation with our panel. It's quite informal. There are no sort of slides or formal presentations. It is a conversation. So I am keen to hear from everybody who's in the room as well. So in a moment, I will open it up for questions as well. But I'll ask a few questions of our panel first. Just to set the scene, and I think really picking up on that conversation we just had in the plenary, for us in Greater Manchester, I think that whole notion of what does growth look like is really important. I'm a big fan of the phrase, it was an American ecologist came up with it, that growth for the sake of growth is actually the logic of a cancer cell. Growth has to be for a reason, and it has to be good growth. And in particular, and the focus of this session largely is on how do we enable growth in Greater Manchester that gets us back on track, and I mean back on track, towards our 2038 net zero target. But just as importantly, these are equally balanced factors. How do we enable growth that is empowering, equitable? How do we secure what many people call a just transition as we get to net zero? So how do we manage that really important balancing act? I think the story of us tackling this, and you know, you've very much got Team Greater Manchester in front of you here. The story of us tackling this, I think, is a really fascinating one because as the first industrial city, we hold a significant amount of this legacy in our hands. We both really drove forward sort of early stage capitalism to create those inequities, but the incredible dynamism of markets. But also, obviously, we, in many ways, shaped the climate challenge that we face today. So I think the role of Greater Manchester in all of this is really fascinating. We were the first city, as Becca said on the main stage, we were the first city to set a science-based target on climate. And that was a brave move because it meant that we had to crunch the numbers. And you heard somebody talking about going carbon negative or carbon positive, depending on which nomenclature you want to use. But we know what our budget looks like. And we know we're overshooting it at the moment. So we have a tough old target ahead of us. But on the upside, and part of the message I think we want to get across to you today is Greater Manchester is a phenomenally buoyant, dynamic, energetic place at the moment. And for those of you who are currently investing in the city region, who've been there, you will be able to see for your own eyes that it's a place transformed. Certainly, like Becca, I arrived to go to uni there. There were 500 residents in the city centre when I arrived to go to university. And obviously now you're talking about, if you bring Salford into the mix, it's something like 100,000. So it's really dramatic, the kind of shift we've seen. And that's my final point I wanted to set out for those of you who Perhaps, I know a couple of people in the audience said you're just venturing into the Greater Manchester market. And that was my final point, which is our growth challenge is about, yes, Manchester and Salford city centres, but we have 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester where we want to see things flourish in Bolton, in Rochdale, in Stockport. And so it's a really fascinating and lovely city region to be grappling with and taking forward on a really beautiful and exciting journey. So that's a scene set, I hope. And I'm going to start to Becca. I was going to come to you first, but you need a rest from all this talking. So I'm going to mix it up a little bit. And John, come to you first, which is maybe continuing something that Rebecca flagged. And to quote Mick Hucknall from Simply Red, you got to do it though. It's Manchester boosterism. Money's too tight to mention. So that really interesting challenge. How do we secure the investment we need to achieve some of these challenges? What Rebecca said, that's really quite tricky. How do we get the investment to net zero? How do we continue the pipeline of development when it's quite challenging in fiscal terms? What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks for dodging that one. Morning, everybody. Something we were actually talking about yesterday, actually, as directors of place at GM level, which was about innovation zones. But what we were saying is, let's avoid just focusing on innovation zones because you get sucked into that and the next funding bus that arrives, the Shares Prosperity Fund or whatever. Actually, step back. What we all collectively at GM trying to achieve, and the basis of that is a 10-year-old Greater Manchester strategy and a 2040 transport plan and a 2038 climate change adoption approach. So that's basically what we're setting out at national, international level is what we're here to do, rather than it being about Salford or Manchester or Bolton or Rochdale. We are almost a collective. We're like the Borg, if you like. What we're then trying to say back to places like central government is actually, the innovation zone agenda, the bigger prize, we were saying, was actually a devolved funding pot for Greater Manchester. And that gives us the power to divvy that up however we feel that can be best utilised. And that's not just about regeneration and development, it's about all things transport, infrastructure, skills. Housing, all these elements, and they're all parts of the agenda now, is all parts of ingredients of sustainable, good growth, is what you said earlier. And so we've got to put our best foot forward in terms of a national government position. We're then saying to the outside world and the investor developer market that we're ready for good business, good developments, and these are our priorities. And you can then talk to an individual district about, Salford, we're going through a process of adopting a new local plan, and that is about inclusive growth, it's about sustainable development, it's about social value, things that you wouldn't necessarily always think is going to be in a local plan. So then we're then also saying to the private investment market, this is how we want to do things. And Becca was saying earlier, viability is the obvious huge challenge, because say if you just look at housing development, you put in good quality housing, placemaking, affordable homes, social homes, net zero. All of these things are adding costs, and the viability is still, the market value is still roughly the same. So we can't always be going cap in hand to government, and so the point about more devolved funding at a GM level for me is very important. And what we've done, one of the tactics we've done is about partnerships. With I even talked to Becca about things that happen in just across our boundaries.
Not always competing.
No, and that is an important point, that we try to. You can't quite divvy it up across 10 authorities, but you try to kind of align, if you like, at a GM level. And a long-term partnership example is with in central Salford with English Cities Fund. That's been going since early 2000s. And that's that is starting to deliver projects like Eden, which is zero carbon. It's powered by renewables. It apparently is going to have the biggest green wall in Europe, and that is just arguably totally unaffordable. So how are we doing it?
Brilliant.
So we're utilising national government funding, devolved GM level funding, other sources of funding, and this long-term partnership to recycle money back into that project.
I think the one of the things, it's good news about the Green Wall, by the way, because Liverpool's currently got the biggest green wall in Europe. So, and given the Eurovision announcement, some of us are still bitter. So I think if we can get one up on Liverpool. John, I think what's really interesting, because it came out in the plenary session, was that alignment point, wasn't it? In that we've got long-term visions in development, in sustainability, in transport, that we can align, even with sometimes quite wildly sort of swerving government policy. I think we're really good at actually making sure that alignment sits there and makes us a more secure investment proposition. I want to come to May, if that's right, May, just bouncing around a little bit, but because you're investing in that Greater Manchester proposition at the moment, it'd be lovely to hear from you about what led you to that decision, and then because I know you're passionate about this, you've got that more holistic long-term vision, so I think it'd be lovely to hear from you why you're investing, but how you bring that vision to bear.
Okay, so my name is May, and I work for something called Trilogy Property. My background's not in the real estate sector. My background's in stakeholder engagement and community development, but I was hired by Trilogy because they really know that to make places that work, you need to involve people and engage them really well. So I think it's really interesting. So again, I went to University of Manchester and stayed, but I also work now in both Manchester and London, and that's really interesting kind of to see both worlds. I think it's really interesting how you talked about the kind of alignment, because where the public sector I think can have really big impact is when you set those big clear goals, and then for us around in terms of if we're as property developers or investors, it really helps us focus if those goals are very clear. And I think that's the same also for central government. So I'll come to that in a minute. But so when I talk to, I report to investors who live in, say, Hong Kong or a big kind of pension fund investors. I have to talk to them about how we're using their money to create places that really work for people. And they now are talking a language which I'm really used to, which is around social value and how you create places that benefit people. And that's completely changed in the last couple of years, I think. So I'm talking to people who've never thought, I feel, when I sit down around tables with them or on Zoom meetings, who've never thought about how to make their buildings or places really inclusive, kind of enabling places for local communities. And I'm giving them really practical examples of how to do that. And I'd like to touch on this, but probably later if you want. But I think that when we look at the challenges that are facing the world, but also the communities that we work in around climate change, it's never been more important, if you're a custodian of a place or land or money, to be thinking about how we create resources that help our communities respond to those challenges. Yeah. So I could happily say more about it, but for the property sector, I think that we have an obligation to be pressing government to help make a level playing field around investment. So I can push for changes in the sector that I'm working in with the investors that I'm working in. But when that framework is set very clearly from local authorities and from central government, it's obviously extremely much more easy. So, and I can see the kind of tangible differences of investment at a kind of ground level when we're having to work to those clear frameworks.
Thanks, mate. I'm going to come back to you in a sec on, in particular, the community aspects of placemaking.
Yeah.
I know you want to get that in, so we will come back to you. And then I'll come to you in a sec on one of those long-term plans that we've got, which is the B network and the transformative impact that will have. But before that, Stephen, I just want to come to you because those list of really important pressures from resilience, which is increasingly important, getting to net zero, creating amazing places that actually are a joy to be in. I know you're really passionate about that list not being challenges, but actually being a really interesting brief and an opportunity. Do you want to expand more on that?
Well, good morning. Yeah, Stephen O'Malley. Yeah, I think some of the themes that came through from this morning, and indeed have been echoed here in this session already, has been about collaboration and considering things holistically. And certainly when it comes to the climate, what we're talking about here is systematic change.
Yeah.
And in addressing that properly, we need to have, clearly the environment doesn't respect governance boundaries or administrative boundaries. We need to start thinking about flooding, water management on a catchment basis, and thinking about how the water courses across our respective districts, whether that's the Medlock in Manchester or the River Irwell, forming the boundary between the two administrations, is of shared interest and shared ownership. But I think there's also huge wider benefits in dealing with these things, and rather than regarding them as points of cost or regarding them as problematic, actually turn that on its head and present them, showcase them, really bring them to the forefront of our consciousness in the cities, so that the cities benefit in terms of the adaptability and the climate resilience, but also the amenity and this overall improved qualities that people will enjoy from having streets and spaces far less dominated by private cars, far easier to walk and cycle around, and far more pleasurable to walk and cycle around. And having those set up as wider networks, wider district networks, so that we don't have this fragmented piecemeal approach to how infrastructure can be delivered or has historically been delivered. And I know Manchester, with the B-lines in particular, has been leading the way on a holistic approach to movement and transport in that sense.
Brilliant, thanks, Stephen. I mean, that's perfectly teed up for you. I mean, and Becky, I'll come back to you now that you got your breath back from the plenary. But that interesting challenge, I was going to save it, but if you wouldn't mind sharing with people our network, our B network video.
I think that's me, sorry. Just sit still.
Stay still. Was that your?
Yep, I'm not moving now. Okay.
Thanks, mate. If you wouldn't mind sharing with us what B Network hopefully will deliver for Greater Manchester in a really dynamic way, but then also we may as well grapple with it. That whole conundrum of we can make public and active transport really affordable and attractive, but do we still need to do something around the demand management of the private car and how that is impacting on our urban spaces?
Thanks, Steve, and good morning, everybody. The transport network in Greater Manchester is undergoing a transformation. Much overused term, but I think it's appropriate for this. In essence, Steve, I like to think about the transport network in Greater Manchester as the 11th district. So we have 10 geographic boroughs, and the transport network is the heartbeat, it's the plumbing that connects up all of that to deliver all of the sorts of things you've been talking about at this conference. So economic growth, access to skills and jobs, the creation of housing and social inclusion. And we have a vision of moving the mode share in Greater Manchester from its current point of 60-40, so 60% of the journeys are conducted by car, basically, and 40% by public transport and active travel. And we want to rapidly balance that out to about 50-50, which will mean shifting 1 million journeys a day out of cars onto more sustainable modes. And it's not pie in the sky. In fact, it's happening right now. So we've cut the bus fares in Greater Manchester to help with the cost of living crisis. There was a whole bunch of announcements last week about bus franchising. The bus network is currently run on a commercial basis. In Greater Manchester, that's being brought within the Mayor's control, which means for the first time ever, we'll be able to plan the network, the bus network alongside Metrolink, the biggest tram network in the UK, and we'll be able to look at that all in the round. I also want to then roll on, and incidentally we'll connect up all the fares and ticketing pipes between all of that just to simplify things. I mean, any of you that are used to London, you just tap go and forget about it, and then you get your net payment at the end of the day. That's where we're going in Greater Manchester, and we will also connect up the rail network with that too. And actually, Steve, before I answer your second question, one of the things, particularly for this audience, that we're particularly interested in is the redevelopment of Manchester's core stations, transport stations, where there's loads of land, and a lot of that's owned by Network Rail, a lot of that's owned by the district, and it just feels to me that actually taking a holistic look at some of those major hubs and how they may be redeveloped for more commercial purposes is something that if any of you ever want to talk about that, we're all ears. I think on that, on your point, Steve, about cars and car parking space and all the rest of it, I think the fact of the matter is that currently the public transport, or historically the public transport provision, has not been as well organised, or it's been fragmented, which means it forces people into cars. So there are certain car journeys that are essential, but what we need to do is shift the ones that aren't into public transport and active travel. My colleague Dame Sarah Story is the Active Travel Commissioner in Greater Manchester, and Sarah and I are working really closely together to make sure that the B network, which is the umbrella term for everything I've been talking about, actually captures all of that. So walking, cycling, wheeling, and public transport. It's the lifeblood and heartbeat of the region. I think it's the biggest transformation of any transport network, certainly in the UK.
And if you've lived in Manchester, you can feel that, can't you? When we were students in Manchester, you'd have one kind of noisy bus that you could go up and down Oxford Road to get into the centre.
And it's still there.
And now we've got a kind of tram network that feels like a European city.
It does. It really does, mate. And I think the other thing I'll just add on the sustainability side of things. So bus franchising is happening in 3 tranches, and the first franchise buses will be on the roads in little over a year's time. And we placed an order week before last for 50 zero-emission buses. About a third of the carbon emissions in the region are transport-led emissions, cars, HGVs, and all that. So we know we've got to do stuff ourselves, as well as that mode shift, that big behaviour change. We've also got to do stuff ourselves, and within a few years' time, the whole bus network in or a third of the bus network in Greater Manchester will be zero emission. I think so. It's the closest to rock and roll that transport gets.
Yeah.
Transport planners get very excited about these things. I think it's completely understandable. But I do think what's really exciting about this panel, you talked about our framework refresh for climate framework, and literally it is the agenda that we're talking about today that encompasses all of it. 76% of the new figures that we've just had through, 76% of our direct emissions in Manchester are from our buildings, and the rest are almost all from transport. So this is within our grasp to grapple it. Becca, I'm coming to you. I'm going to ask if anybody's got any questions in the audience in a sec. All points to make. I'm a great believer in they don't have to be questions. I know that sounds contrary to the instructions you were given earlier, but it's not all about the sage on the stage. Becca, cars are the enemy, aren't they? No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to say that. I wanted to pick up on the investment point, but feel free to touch on cars if you'd like. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about how we are trying to tackle this, aren't we, specifically? And Manchester is in the 3CI project, looking at what does this investment proposition. Do you want to share that? Because people may not know about that.
Yeah, and you'll have to remind me what 3CI actually stands for.
Cities Commission on Climate Investment.
So we're working with the Connected Cities Catapult to look at trying to unpick some of those funding questions and issues that I referenced in the panel sort of this morning. You know, I don't think we have the answers. I don't think that means, you know, we should be wholly sort of pessimistic about this. There are different mechanisms that we can explore. And I think, you know, sort of, again, we said it this morning, you know, we're working together to try and find the solutions. We're not necessarily waiting for government to come up with the answers. They've been great at coming up with the answers over the last couple of weeks. So how do we make investment propositions attractive to private finance? How do we blend investment? How do we get greater certainty of investment? You know, Stephen has suggested previously to sort of Manchester and others, you know, can we do local carbon offsetting and use that investment to drive sustainability at a local level? We've still got work to do to try and explore that. And then how does sustainability work on a place base? So, you know, when people think about Manchester, they often look at the city centre. But we've got huge development areas outside the city centre, North Manchester. We've recently just sort of acquired the lease. We've already got the freehold to the whole of Wythenshawe town centre. That gives us an unrivaled platform there to look at what we do with that. So, you know, it's traditional. I don't even know when it was built. I think probably the 1950s. So your traditional sort of precinct type shopping centre offer. So we know we need something else in there. There's scope for, we think, about 1,500 new homes. Your traditional sort of retail will play a part, but a leisure offer, a food and drink offer. You know, we're building in quality public spaces and active travel from the outset. It's already pretty well connected well, there's the airport line on on rail, but also a Metrolink line. But how do we design in sustainability from the outset? And again, we know what we want in high level. We've not specified sort of technically, but can we start to bring partners, investors in from the outset to start to look at how we might be able to do some of that? And if you've got a place-based approach, I think you stand a much better chance at looking at maybe cross-subsidising some of what we want to do. You know, could EV charging points that, you know, could generate a return? Is there a way of creating some sort of circular model? So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do, to come up with some of the solutions instead of just saying it's a huge bill and we haven't got the money.
Well, I think for me, and get ready to ask questions or make points, please, everybody in the audience. But it's something that I thought of during that first session today is examples like Wythenshawe, but also some of the huge examples we've got across the whole of Greater Manchester show that if the priority now is growth, the headroom for growth is huge in our city region. We have a great partnership-based approach. We have some incredible areas that have huge potential still. And I would argue the southeast in particular doesn't have that same headroom potentially. So it's a really nice bit of complementarity. Okay, now we've got about 15 minutes left. Does anybody have any thoughts they want to share? We've got a mic. If you don't mind, we've got a chap down just past halfway. If you tell us who you are, and we'll pick it up with the panel.
Thank you. My name's Jean-Michel Bellis. I'm a Director of Energy Solutions at Silver EMS. My question is, in your opening comments, you mentioned a lot about sustainability and also holistic approaches. So the question is, from the panel's perspective, what key things are needed to go beyond the sustainability agenda and move towards a regenerative, holistic, whole life approach to infrastructure in a low carbon economy?
Brilliant. Lovely question. I'm glad you used the R word, regenerative, in there. That was brilliant. It did occur to me that the other long-term trajectory, if you like, the 12th district on top of Vernon's 11th, could be nature itself and how we enable nature recovery. I might just take a couple more just for time. Anybody else got one, or do you want me to? Yes, it's a chapter here if you don't mind. Tell us who you are.
So I'm Nick Durston. I run South Bank Employees Group in South Bank Business and Premier District, obviously on London South Bank. So you mentioned a financial devolution deal. Can I ask your perspective as to what the downsides, or the potential downsides of a devolution deal could be? Because London's had, in my view, some mixed experiences with the devolved deal. But I'm interested how you see that as a potential risk as well as being a solution.
Great. Two very different questions there. I won't try and bundle those into the same answer because that would be really tricky. On the first one, I'm going to come to you guys at the end actually, May and Stephen, on that holistic approach, a regenerative vision for what we can do with our cities. What are your thoughts? May, you go first.
So I think that if you manage buildings, you have a responsibility to put resources in that unlock other people's resources. And space is a really important component of what communities need to thrive. So what I mean by that is we saw in the pandemic, for example, that a whole kind of upswelling of self-help groups, of people on WhatsApp groups, people buying each other, helping each other with shopping or looking out for people. I know that, I know it from my years of working on a community development level, if you put great, high-quality, well-managed spaces in place, it unlocks communities' resources to be able to help themselves. So if you manage any buildings, you need to be creating high quality spaces for people to meet, to organise, to gather, and that's green spaces and indoor spaces. So I manage a building at the Great Northern and we have a village hall. It's only been open a matter of weeks. It's already full of a home education group who meet there. We offer that space free to community use if it's not for profit. There's counselling sessions that happen there now. There's training sessions around climate change. Tenants and residents committees meet there. There's going to be a warm spaces offer for this winter to help people and children do homework in warm spaces. So we know that a tiny investment from a landlord like that unlocks a whole kind of cascade of creativity and strength from the community. But so, yeah, for me, it's just the key around kind of regenerative development is making sure that at every level we're talking to people about what they need and listening. So that devolution around money, that needs to happen at every level. And in my experience, the property sector is kind of weak at that. And there's some very basics of how you do that. On Friday evening, I sat in the foyer of a tower block near where we're going to put a new development, or we're asking to, and just sat and listened to people. I spent 4 hours having a really nice conversation with people about the place they live, and the things that they wanted to see and what would improve the places that they're going to live. And yeah.
Sorry, Meg.
Go for it.
Stephen.
Yeah, picking up on that same point in many respects, I think emotional intelligence is something that is becoming increasingly important and recognised in terms of offering that longer term value. So technical excellence, absolutely, but it's then being much more responsive to the geography and the landscape and the communities that are already there. But I think the other key part of that is, and it was something that came through from the Argent chap on the panel this morning, was about time. And I think you've made the point with the English Cities collaboration, 10, 15, 20-year horizons offer the opportunity for people to make, our groups, our communities, to make sensible decisions that get a payback, to create value and then recover that return over a longer period. And I think Mayfield Depot is a really good example of that. The collaboration there with LCR, London Continental Railways, TFGM, Manchester City Council, and you and I as was. And the park has opened as recently as last week. Yeah. The daylighting of the River Medlock and putting the park at the front of that, but also retrofitting the depot building itself and the vitality that's come forward for what was a meanwhile use with Frey Island, which is just absolutely thriving. So,
thanks, Stephen.
Can I just come in on the sort of the holistic approach to sustainability and regeneration? And actually, I think it does lead into the devolution point as well. But it's not, we're at a London real estate forum, aren't we? So we're talking an awful lot about the built environment, but it is much broader than that. So it is what you're building, how you're treating the buildings that you've got. It's how you get to your buildings on transport. The people element is really important as well. So the upskilling, the new jobs, the sort of growth of green sectors, I think, is really key. And the Manchester City Council climate change action plan and the climate change framework for the city as a whole really tries to focus in on those key themes and bring them together in a holistic way. I think equality is really important in this as well, because let's be frank, the people sitting in the poorest quality, least efficient homes are the ones that are going to be really, really struggling as temperatures drop in the next few months as well. So I also think that holistic approach is really important to driving out greater equality in growth within Manchester and the wider, well, just generally. And then in terms of devolution, I'd be interested to sort of get your views maybe after this in terms of sort of where you think there have been disbenefits. But unless you've got that greater certainty of funding, unless you've got a greater ability to blend your funding streams in a coherent way to meet your coherent framework, it's always going to be a challenge. And I think it has got particularly severe over the last few years, I've got to say. You're bidding for a 20 million pot of levelling up funding here, and oh, by the way, you can bid for all 5 of your constituencies if you've got the time and resource. You won't get it, obviously. And then you've got a GM transport transport settlement to try and distribute across 10, but you've got, like, I don't know, was it 6 weeks to try and do it? You know, that doesn't encourage any kind of strategic approach to holistic regeneration and sustainability at all. And that's why devolution, if we can get it in a meaningful way, is really important.
Vernon, and then now comes you, John.
If I can just build on that point, so I see no downside, and in fact, even with the devoted funding settlements that we have got on capital and revenue, and we're grateful for it, incidentally, from government. You know, I'm not moaning, but you know, they get down into details that they just don't need to deal with. We know how to deal with the local transport environment and the needs of local communities. And you know, having senior people in government asking us whether the Bury bus interchange should be redeveloped and things like that, you just think, just go and think about something else. You know, sorry, I'm not being flippant, but even with the stuff that is currently devolved, there is a bit too much central intervention, which slows stuff down, and we can move much faster. And I think the thing I would observe, and I'm only recently, working in Greater Manchester, but the togetherness of the leaders, the mayor, the 10 districts, all coming together, and government trusts the administrative machine in Greater Manchester. I mean, it's got devolved money for healthcare, skills, and for transport, and it's a really, really credible thing. And I think we just need more of it.
Yeah, thanks.
What central government should be leading? Sorry.
May. Hang on, I was going to come to John if that's all right, mate. The self-chairing at the end there.
Sorry, mate.
Sorry.
I mean, we've kind of said it already, but spot funding gives you spot development. It doesn't give you sustainable development. It doesn't give you place making, whether that's at a local level, a kind of a neighbourhood level, or a regional level at EGGM. I mean, thinking about some negatives, we're only given certain tools in the tool bag, aren't we? There's lots of other tools that central government retain. There's also elements of, well, there's your pot of money, go and do it as well, and nothing else is going to come your way. And actually, you know, really, we should be, when you're talking about placemaking and sustainable development, you should be talking 10 to 20 years, and at best we get 3 to 5 at best in a devolution approach, don't we? So, I mean, the City Region Sustainable Transport Fund, you know, is £1 billion over 5 years, isn't it? Yeah. So, yeah, that's good, but it's only arguably one tool in the tool bag, isn't it?
And 200 million raised locally on top of that as well.
Okay, I will come back to you in a second, but I just want to check whether anybody else got a question. We'll have 2 more very briefly, and then I'll come to you, May. So this chap here and that chap there in the blue shirt, and then we'll wrap this up.
Hey, Ben Dupont. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a prop tech called We Maintain. We talked about plumbing from a transport perspective, but I guess there's another plumbing interesting opportunity on the data side. I think we all inherited cities from the industrial age that make it by design extremely complicated to manage. And I think there's an amazing opportunity on the data side to kind of bridge across all the diversities of both being private, public, different set types of assets. So what's your vision on this? How do you work with PropTech? What's your thoughts? I mean, there's many cities around the world working on this. Of course, we have a lot of solutions to offer, but what's your view on this?
Okay, lovely. And we'll just take this chap here as well, and then we'll come back to the panel. We'll start, I think, on data and then do a more broad wrap-up.
Hello, I'm Mark Schilling-Renica in Manchester, Mancunian, born and bred. Key thing for me, obviously, is the park at Mayfield being open. It's a delight. I'm looking forward to walking around it on Friday for the first time. And I think it's fundamental to the carbon agenda and the transport agenda to retain families in Manchester, people living there longer, not moving out when they're 25 to Didsbury, etc., etc. And it's fundamental. We're involved in that as a company with the school and the medical centre and things that we're supplying at Great Jackson Street. I think the green space doesn't need to stop at Mayfield. I think there has to be constant strides for further parks in the city centre, because that on its own, as wonderful as it is when I walk around it, is not going to solve it. I drive past Great Ancoat Street every day and think, in terms of New Islington, whether the bit where Toys R Us used to be, whether that is an opportunity for another park. I know it's not as simple as that because it's owned and it's going to be developed, etc., etc. But I'm constantly looking for opportunities for further Mayfields, which I think will help retain people in the city centre, which is a fundamental. And I'd like to ask the Transport for Greater Manchester gentleman, sorry I didn't catch your name. I drive from Urmston down Chester Road every day, and I see the cones that are there for 3 years, so stuff, the controversial cones. Everyone at work, cycling, brilliant, fantastic sort of thing, but it's how you just explain to a layman like me who's stuck in his car for an extra 10 minutes a day, how that is a positive when I don't see enough cycles there to justify the means. I'm sorry to ask 2 random questions there. But
That's all right.
And
I know the first one is beautiful and made me feel a little bit wibbly wobbly and teary inside, so that's fantastic. More Mayfields. I'm going to go right across the panel. I won't get distracted by the cones on the A56, even though I could, because I feel very strongly about them. Let's go. Vernon, you've got a couple of things to pick up there, but if we start with you, and then I'll come to May and come back round.
I'd love to address the data point, if I may. So I worked for Transport for London for 15 years, and one of the first things we did is made all of our data sets freely and openly available to apps developers and others, not just to produce transporty stuff, but also to put alongside other data sets. And I think we've got a colleague from the GLA here. There's in London, that you've got the sort of data warehouse, which puts together all of the data sets. And people that are looking to invest or look at creative ways of solving problems have access to that to put all the story together. So I would liberalise all of the data in a consumable format that people can ask intelligent questions of and make connections that we won't necessarily make. I think it's a really powerful way of leveraging it. I think on the cones and all of that sort of thing, it's a combination, isn't it? We do need to. There's no point being stuck in the traffic. The traffic has to flow. So we need to invest in bus lanes, which will get more car drivers who don't have to drive. As I mentioned earlier on, I'm not anti-car. I just think that there are unnecessary car journeys that we can move people from, which will make your journey flow and will make the public transport journeys flow. And a combination of segregated space for active travel and also bus priority lanes so that people can have certainty of journey time. And one of the major, sorry, I'll shut up in a minute. And one of the major suppressants of all of this is the unpredictability of public transport journey time. And if you can free up the flow and know you're going to be in the office in 45 minutes, you may well pay £2 for the bus rather than £3.50 for your petrol.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Vernon. I always like the phrase: when you say you're stuck in traffic, you need to remember that you actually are traffic.
You are.
Right, we're going to do 30 seconds each, and then I'm wrapping this up. So, May, 30 seconds from you, and then finish up.
I just feel like if we're talking about sustainability, it's important to, for me, it's important to name the climate crisis that is coming down the road, and that this year we're already really seeing it. We're seeing forest fires in France this summer. We're seeing huge, unbelievable levels of flooding in Pakistan. Started off with 60% of Pakistan is underwater, and it's now 30%. We're going to see increased food insecurity. We're going to see, where I live in Yorkshire now, we're going to see increased flooding. What that means is that the pressure on the most vulnerable communities across the world and in our communities is simply going to rise. And that means that all of us at any level, whether we're in the private sector or the public sector, we need to be pushing government for proper, strategic, systemic action on the climate crisis. We're looking at the greatest challenge that humanity faces. And somehow in the discussions around net zero and all the work we're doing, it doesn't really hit enough. Yeah.
Very good point. Stephen, very quick.
I wasn't born in Manchester. I didn't study in Manchester. I get the privilege to work all the way across the UK, and I live in Manchester, and I love Manchester. And I cycle in on that coned-off lane from Altrincham into the city centre, and it's horrendous. It's stressful, super stressful. So, and I'm a seasoned cyclist. How are we expected to have others who aren't as stupid, frankly, in some respects, to take their life in their own, to do their life in their own hands. But my long-winded point there, sorry, is that we need to make sure that the measures are in place to create a landscape which makes that choice more attractive than driving. That's what we've got to get to. So that traffic is not about a war on the car per se. It's actually making the alternatives more attractive.
Thanks, Stephen. John, last seconds.
Green infrastructure, if you put it that way, without partnership, would Mayfield have delivered that green infrastructure?
Yeah, very, very good point. Thanks.
But
as brief as that.
It's not all, I mean, we're not going to deliver a park at that scale anytime soon, but I think green infrastructure is demand driven as well now as well, quality public spaces. So, you know, Ancoats retail park is a prime employment site primarily, but it will need an element of public amenity space, and you'll see it in Ancoats Phase 3, on Islington Green. It's, you know, we need green spaces.
Brilliant, perfect. Right, I'm sorry we've run a little bit over, but we did start late, so that's my excuse. So we've covered a huge amount there. For you, those of you who haven't had the pleasure of coming to Greater Manchester, I hope we've done a good job depicting a city region that is going somewhere really exciting really quickly. And if you're very, very lucky, you can cycle down that coned off section and take your life in your own hands. I'd just like to ask you to thank our guests very much for all they contributed. Thanks very much.